Okay. It is my extraordinary pleasure to welcome Dr. Alice Wilson. Alice is an incredible anthropologist. She does really, really fabulous and fascinating work. Her first book had to do with the Western Sahara, but the book that we're obviously discussing is about the afterlives of revolution in Oman and specifically in the Dhofar province. Alice's work is sensitive and incredibly beautifully written, and it is genuinely a pleasure to have her bring to make this sort of the last of the presentations for this year's Center for Gulf Studies virtual seminar series, sort of the cherry on top. The format for, I'm sure you guys have all been attending, but the format for those who may not be familiar is that Alice is going to talk a little bit, very briefly, about her own trajectory. It's a mode for us to sort of understand where people's projects and research interests come from. And then afterwards, she'll have a presentation and she'll talk about her presentation, and then we'll open the floor to questions. So hold up all your questions, keep them there so that we could discuss them. And on that note, Alice, I'd like to cede the Zoom to you. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you so much, Lale, for this very kind introduction. So let me just try and share. Is that all looking as it should at your end?
Yes.
Wonderful. Thanks so much. So it's such an honor to be in conversation with the Centre for Gulf Studies at Exeter. There are so many colleagues here who've been a great inspiration to me. Lana Khalili, of course, Marc Valéry, Ross Porter, Claire Beaugrand. And I also want to very much mention and thank the wonderful archivist at the Arab World Documentation Unit, James Downs, and he brought so many insights to this project. And thank you to everybody for making it during a very busy term. There are many responsibilities for Ramadan and also many global events that are preoccupying us. So thank you for this chance to be in conversation. Before sharing more about my research on the legacies of revolution in Oman, I'm first going to share some brief reflections about my journey to this project. So for the past 20 years, my anthropological research has focused on revolutionary social change. And the key question that I've addressed here over 2 projects, which have led to the monographs that you can see here, is how do revolutionary movements shape state power and social change? And how do their impacts and legacies relate to intended revolutionary agendas? Because of course, intentions and outcomes don't necessarily match. So I focused on projects for revolutionary state building and social change in 2 national anti-colonial liberation movements in Southwest Asia and North Africa. So my first project examined Western Sahara's anti-colonial liberation movement, and that's a movement that is still active today. I traced the recycling of existing social relations, specifically those of tribes, in order to build revolutionary state power in exile in the Sahrawi refugee camps in Algeria. So that argument about recycling social relations and tribal social relations in particular was in some ways a counterintuitive argument, because the explicit discourse of Western Sahara's liberation movement, like that of many other anti-colonial liberation movements, and indeed many post-colonial states, was anti-tribal and construed tribes and the hierarchies between them as a threat to their projects for nationalism. So over 2 years of fieldwork with Sahrawi refugees, I learned from them how various projects of revolutionary state building in the very challenging conditions of exile and resisting occupation nevertheless involved the recycling and reworking of older tribal social relations in order to build forms of revolutionary state power, such as labor pooling mechanisms. And in this context, where in exile, it's not possible to do some of the more familiar forms of state power activities like extracting taxes, mobilizing the refugees and their labor power was a very important aspect of the state-citizen relations there. So looking at those processes helps us to see revolutions in fresh ways. Revolutionaries themselves, and indeed many scholarly analyses of revolutions, often emphasize revolution as a moment of rupture and break with the past. And there are, of course, many experiences that people experience as a rupture during revolutions, especially, for instance, around projects to try and build social equality and achieve social leveling. For instance, focusing on the emancipation of minoritized categories of persons, especially women and enslaved persons, in the case of the two liberation movements that I've studied. So yes, there are forms of rupture, but revolutions also need to draw on and rework existing social relations and the past in order to create revolutionary futures. Crucially, I found that some of the revolutionary social forms that proved most robust in withstanding the challenges of exile and long-term resisting occupation were the very forms that reworked and recycled older tribal relations, such as tribal labor pooling mechanisms that I argue, and inspired by refugees' own accounts of it, they saw how these were reworkings and transformations of older, those older tribal labor pool mechanisms, that people understood that they were transforming them to constitute these new revolutionary forms of labor pooling mechanisms. But in the new forms, they would be overcoming tribal differences rather than working through them. So I found that some forms of continuity, intersecting with forms of transformation, were not necessarily obstacles to revolution, but could contribute to its survival. And the building of revolutionary state power could draw on and recycle the social relations of what I saw as a different, older project of sovereignty, in that context, one of tribes. So a driving question in that project was, how does a revolution survive and change over several decades? So my second project in Oman has in one sense reversed that question, asking, what survives of revolution after military defeat? Very briefly, I'm arguing in that project that in the light of lasting legacies of revolution that I call afterlives, we must rethink revolution, counterinsurgency, and post-war histories. So before turning to that in more detail, I'm going to share a few words about current and future research projects, and feedback and questions on these are, of course, also welcome. So right now I'm reviewing the translation of Arabic into Arabic of Afterlives of Revolution, which is going to be published by Dar Su'al in Lebanon. And I'm looking forward to engaging with feedback as the book reaches new audiences. Some of my next steps are to continue where Afterlives of Revolution concludes. I want to further examine how the values that revolutionaries once promoted, such as social inclusivity, gender egalitarianism, and opposition to enslavement, inspire and reappear in post-war platforms for progressive politics, such as electoral leagues and also in the 2011 protests that took place in Salalah, the main city of southern Oman. And they also took place in other parts of Oman, but I'm particularly interested in the intersection of those protests with this revolutionary background in the south. I also want to look more at a different aspect of afterlives, namely what we might call the afterlives of counterinsurgency and paramilitaries. So the counterinsurgency campaign during the 60s and 70s, in the 70s, particularly recruited locals to be pro-government paramilitaries. And I'd read about that, but when I came to do research there 40 years later, those paramilitary brigades still exist and have new kinds of roles in the post-war context. And then looking further ahead, I'm planning a comparative project that will draw on both the contexts where I've done fieldwork, Northwest Africa and Southern Arabia. In both settings, enslavement continued into the 1970s, and it was the liberation movements that I've been able to study that emancipated enslaved persons. And I seek to foreground experiences of the enslaved and the formerly enslaved in these abolitionist projects of late 20th century Arab liberation movements, which is, I think, a story about abolitionism that is not enough known, certainly in Anglophone audiences. Nala also invited me to reflect today on highlights and challenges of my research trajectory. This is an opportunity for me to say, especially as an ethnographer, what a privilege it is and how grateful I am to have learned so much from research participants who hail from Western Sahara and from Oman. The most wonderful highlight, of course, has to be fieldwork and the invitations from interlocutors to get to know more about their lives. Research participants I've worked with during 2 years of fieldwork in the case of Western Sahara and 5 months of fieldwork in the case of Oman have been incredible teachers, and they've extended many invitations for solidarity. Research participants I've had the privilege of getting to know are facing enormous challenges of living during a conflict or in the aftermath of conflict, and of living with local, national, and global structural inequalities and injustices. These kinds of predicaments in varied forms are uncomfortably familiar for too many people in the region and indeed beyond. The challenges that research participants that I've had the privilege of working with are facing in their daily lives necessarily raise challenges for conducting and disseminating research that addresses these conditions. And I'll shortly address some of these challenges concerning authoritarian surveillance and censorship in the case of my research in Oman. Whenever I encounter these challenges, again, I'm grateful for the opportunities through which I've learned alongside interlocutors, colleagues, students, friends, and activists how much stronger we are in facing these challenges by committing to networks of solidarity and to caring for one another. So let me share a little bit more about the legacies of revolution in Oman and their significance for rethinking revolution, counterinsurgency, and post-war aftermaths. So in this project, I ask what survives of revolutionary values, relationships, and projects of social change after military defeat and in conditions of ongoing authoritarian repression. Does counter-revolutionary violence, including, in the case of Oman, an allegedly model counterinsurgency campaign, prevent a revolution from having lasting impacts? If there are legacies of revolution that survive military defeat, how specifically do they survive? And in the light of these legacies, what kinds of new questions and interpretations can we explore about revolution, counterinsurgency, and their aftermaths? I've been exploring these questions in the case of Oman's anti-colonial revolution and liberation movement, but these questions are especially important and timely right now in Southwest Asia and North Africa. They help us to think about the revolutions that began in 2010 and 2011 and in the years thereafter, and that have overwhelmingly met with repression. But in the light of the experiences of the earlier generation of anti-colonial revolutionaries in the region from the 90s and 60s, such as in Oman, we can see how these conditions can still allow these revolutions to go on to have lasting impacts. So the outlines of Dhofar and its revolution are likely to be familiar to many in Exeter's Centre for Gulf Studies, and so I'm going to rehearse it only in the briefest terms here. Dhufar is a region that spans coast, mountains, and desert on the southern edge of Arabia, which you can see on the map here. And today is the southernmost governorate of the Sultanate of Oman, a country that took that name and territorial form in 1970 during the Dhofar conflict. The Muscat-based, British-backed Al Busaid dynasty of sultans claimed Dhufar in the late 19th century. The Faris chafed under their harsh rule, and in 1965, the Faris founded an anti-colonial liberation front that went on to have several names. So for simplicity, I'll just refer to it as the front. This front fought for emancipation from the British-backed sultans for the Dhufar, but they extended their vision to envisage broader emancipation for the what they perceived as the occupied Arabian Gulf. And at the same time, they were also struggling for social emancipation. Like I was mentioning, these revolutionary projects, in this case, very much inspired by Marxism, Leninism, and Maoism, to try and achieve social emancipation. And this is one very famous image of the revolution that speaks to those projects of radical social change. This liberation front faced a British-led, increasingly internationalized counterinsurgency, and this is a campaign that deployed extensive violence. And over time, it also developed a hearts and minds campaign that sought to win over local support, such as by offering welfare measures in fields such as schooling and healthcare. By 1976, the counterinsurgency campaign defeated the liberation movement. The Dhufar became the home in the post-war period to former participants in the revolution, living under the post-war rule of the government that they had once opposed. Telling this history has nevertheless been far from simple. After the war, Oman's post-war government has expunged the revolution, as well as government violent to repress it, from official history. So it's taken this position of an official silence regarding this revolution. So in Oman, there are no monuments or museums or textbooks that mention the revolution. And that official silence raises many ethical and methodological challenges for this project, to which I'll return. In contrast, in the decades after the war's end, some British veterans of the counterinsurgency and some scholars have eulogized an allegedly model counterinsurgency campaign, focusing on claims that the campaign allegedly won hearts and minds, such as through resource distribution. Both these approaches are deeply problematic. They either erase or legitimize colonial counterinsurgency violence. Both approaches neglect what we might call counterhistories, histories that retrieve the experiences of marginalized subjects, in this case, revolutionaries who go on to meet with military defeat. My book sets out to retrieve those counterhistories through an ethnographic analysis of the afterlives or lasting legacies of revolution. To do so, the project stands on the shoulders of giants. A first set of these giants are the Omanis themselves, who are bravely contesting official censorship in order to reclaim the revolution as a significant period of national history and identity. We can see some of those Omanis and their projects here. I'm happy to speak more about that in Q&A. And it's precisely because Omanis themselves are reclaiming this revolution as a topic that they see as nationally significant, that's one of the reasons I see a cautious mandate for doing research on such a sensitive topic. The retrieval of the revolution is also taking place through the work of scholars, as I mentioned, in Oman and also beyond Oman, who are putting this revolution back on the map of the global histories of revolutions. And of course, the key landmark here is the work of historian Abdelrazak Takriti, whose book you can see on the left here, whose landmark study, Monsoon Revolution, retrieves the agency of Oman's revolutionaries and their shaping of the course of history. And these retellings in turn build on the work of Marc Valéry and others who are telling a history of Oman that is contesting and deconstructing official narratives and their silences. In addition to these projects to retrieve the revolution, there's been extensive criticism of the so-called model campaign thesis, and this focuses on the counterinsurgency's extensive use of violence against the Faris, airstrikes, food and water blockades, mass force displacement, and the destruction of the subsistence economy, all of which are very tragically, unhappily familiar to us today. So all of these techniques show the importance of violence for the achievement of the counterinsurgency victory, and they belie claims of a victory being about winning hearts and minds through distributing resources, and belie claims of having avoided violence that affected civilians. And of course, as Lala Khalili has shown, violence against civilians, such as sieges, food blockades, and the confinement of whole communities, is absolutely constitutive of counterinsurgency campaigns, and Dhufar certainly speaks to that. So these debates, with their focus on revisiting events that happened during the revolution, for those studies that are looking at the Dhufar Revolution, and indeed more widely in revolution studies, tends to be, for obvious reasons, a tendency to focus on what happened during the revolution, lead me to make two interventions in my book. The first is to take up an ethnographic lens that situates experiences within social and historical contexts in order to revisit events during the revolution and the counterinsurgency. So the first three chapters of the book are a historical ethnography of the revolution and counterinsurgency. And in this part of the research, the main sources that I consulted are in Arabic and English. They include archives, many of which I was able to get to know thanks to James Downs in Exeter, historical studies, and also oral testimonies that I collected during fieldwork. So I used this ethnographic focus to retrieve revolutionary agency and to retrieve the revolution as one of the factors that transformed space and society in the Gulf region. I use it to differentiate between the rival projects of social change of the revolution and the counterinsurgency respectively. Both of them, at least over time, came to offer projects such as schooling, healthcare, infrastructure, but their visions were not interchangeable because the revolutionary projects were trying to promote social egalitarianism, whereas the counterinsurgency projects were deliberately trying to stoke tribal rivalries as part of a divide and rule strategy. I also use this ethnographic lens to further contest the model campaign thesis. This thesis has denigrated the revolution as a Red Terror campaign. The ethnographic move here is not to deny revolutionary violence, which certainly happened. Rather, the ethnographic move is to contextualize revolutionary violence within the transformations of indigenous categories of political violence in contexts of colonialism, revolution, and counterinsurgency. And when we bring that context to the fore, we can see that Red Terror narratives rely on erasing that historical context. So a first contribution is bringing that ethnographic lens to the discussion of events at the time. A second contribution is to extend the timeline to include not just what happened at the time, but to think about what happened after what's usually seen as the end of the revolution. And so the second half of the book is a fieldwork-driven ethnography of the post-war lives of some former revolutionaries living in post-war Dhufar. I did fieldwork in Oman for 5 months in 2015. I was able to meet former revolutionaries informally. I also met some other Omanis and family members, and that helped me put experiences of former revolutionaries in a comparative context to try and understand what might be distinctive there. I met 26 former revolutionaries. The length of fieldwork and the opportunities to meet former revolutionaries and the kinds of conversations that we had reflect the challenging conditions of fieldwork under an authoritarian security state. This is a context that raises many ethical and methodological challenges, including the question, of course, of the safety of research participants in Oman. And I've sought to address these in various ways. During fieldwork, it was very important to let Omanis, who had much more experience than me of conditions of surveillance there, to direct conversation, as you know, they knew how to manage the red lines in the ways that of their choosing. There were also many dilemmas around writing. I consulted Omanis on some early draft material, and based on their feedback, I realized I needed to do more to remove certain kinds of material and also to think more carefully about how to anonymize people, such as, for instance, when I flag in the text that I might be splitting one person's words over several pseudonyms, or flagging a fictive composite person who is voicing the words of what were actually several people. So introducing noise in various ways. Also, the book seeks to address only kinds of information that Omanis and those who surveil them know about. So they know, for instance, that former revolutionaries live in this region and meet each other in planned and unplanned ways in everyday situations. And the book makes no argument that the everyday practices of former revolutionaries constitute a form of resistance of concern to the state authorities. Navigating these intersecting constraints and possibilities, during my fieldwork, I had the privilege of learning how some, by no means all, veteran militants, to different degrees that reflect their own positionalities and relative privilege or marginalization, created afterlives or lasting legacies of revolution when they reproduced revolutionary values of social egalitarianism along lines of gender, social status, tribe, and racialized identities. Three areas about which I was able to learn during my fieldwork from my own positionality are the focus of the book's final 3 chapters. I look at kinship practices, for instance, how former revolutionaries name children, even some children born in the post-war period, after revolutionary figures, both Dhufari and international, such as Rosa Luxemburg. I look at everyday socializing, for instance, how some former revolutionaries form friendships across conventional differences of gender, racialized identity, tribe, and status groups. This is not a picture of former revolutionaries, but is a picture of some men relaxing in the evening. Probably they're doing that right now in Salalah. Those groups, I learned, usually bring together men who have a shared social origin and background. And the difference was the group of former revolutionaries that I met who met in public in the same place every night, but they span different backgrounds. So that's one example of these kinds of forms of everyday socializing that reproduce these values of social inclusivity and egalitarianism. But there were also times when everyday acts weren't enough to echo some of those values. And so that chapter also looks at, the limits of the everyday and the need to sometimes turn to extraordinary acts. So I'm going to say a bit more about kinship and the everyday socializing in the latter part of the presentation. I'll just dwell briefly now on the final chapter, which addresses unofficial commemoration. So it's looking at things like how some former revolutionaries repurpose funerals and other forms of ritual to find ways to unofficially commemorate the revolution that, of course, official histories have erased. The wider context for this chapter is as Magvalei and others have showed, that there is a very much Sultan-centric official commemoration culture in Oman. And this chapter looks at the informal, unofficial commemoration of the revolution, positing that we can see this actually as a transformation of an earlier episode, because when the revolution was active in its heyday, it invested heavily in commemorative cultures. And actually, that was beginning before Sultan Qaboos took the throne. And so, as Magvalei and others have shown, it's very important to understand Sultan Qaboos's interest in commemoration through issues such as his legitimacy deficit and the fact that he needed to create this commemorative culture to help legitimize his position. But by looking at how actually there was this earlier episode of revolutionary commemorative culture, and how some former revolutionaries who changed sides took knowledge practice of that and introduced it into the counterinsurgency campaign, I also suggest that we can see that earlier episode of revolutionary commemorative culture as one of the other factors that then went on to shape the following Sultan-centric official commemoration culture under Sultan Qaboos. So it's one way of achieving revolutionary agency. And then also we see that, I'm arguing, this revolutionary official commemoration didn't disappear, and it converted into this unofficial commemoration. I'm happy to talk more about that in Q&A. But let me, for now, talk more broadly about what the implications are of this finding of these afterlives of ongoing legacies of revolution. And I'm going to, this will be the last part of the presentation, and I'm going to think about how these afterlives speak back to some of the very problematic claims of the model counterinsurgency thesis, and through that also open up wider questions about revolution, counterinsurgency, and post-war life. So I'm going to first take up one strand of the model campaign thesis, and then which is the idea that the revolution was unpopular, ultimately with Dhafaris, and through that open up to wider questions in revolution studies. So you can find evidence of claims of the unpopularity of the revolution through various model campaign narratives, discussions of the Red Terror, etc. So from the perspective of Afterlives, we can contest this idea that the revolution was unpopular with Dhafaris, because we can see that at least for some participants in the revolution, revolutionary values had an enduring appeal that outlasted military defeat and that people continued to engage with in their post-war lives. And these findings have significant implications for revolution studies. So revolution studies, as I mentioned, understandably has tended to focus on what happened during the revolution. Afterlives invite us to develop an additional analytical lens, what we might call what survives of revolution. And this perspective foregrounds the lasting appeal of revolutionary values and the extended times, spaces, and impacts of revolution in the post-war period. So through Afterlives, we can broaden our maps and timelines of how and when revolutions have impacts. Such a focus on afterlives and what survives of revolution can help us step away from a debate that has been prominent in some political science and historical approaches to revolution, which distinguishes between successful and failed revolutions on the grounds that the successful ones are those that eventually come to take over state power. And of course, the outcome of a revolution is very significant, perhaps most of all for revolutionaries themselves. But from the point of view of afterlives of revolution, we can also see that revolutions with a range of outcomes, including military defeat and repression, still go on to have lasting impacts. And that insight destabilizes that dichotomy between failed and successful revolutions. And we can actually see that revolutions, even when they've apparently failed, we need to recognize how they can still be having ongoing impacts. And then a further question is that we can expand upon a core question in revolution studies, which is, what is the nature of revolution? And these are some of the studies from an anthropological perspective that I took inspiration from in the book, that look back at revolutions and what is the nature of social change there. And in the light of attention to afterlives, we can extend into a further question to drill down and say, well, what are the qualities of revolutionary social change that can lay foundations for and accommodate lasting impacts beyond military defeat? So if we return to that memorable image of the female guerrilla fighter, when we see this kind of image, it seems to speak to one possible explanation. Is it because revolutionaries are so devoted to the revolution that the revolution can go on and have lasting impacts even beyond military defeat and the challenges that that brings. So I think that that body of work, very detailed empirical work about revolutions, historical approaches, anthropological approaches, and related disciplines, and what I found in my own work in Dhufar suggests another explanation, not a route of it's because people are so unswervingly committed. The other possibility that I explore is inspired by the fact that when we look at what people are doing in these revolutionary movements, we find that they're often not following a script of revolutionary social change. The revolution may have broad headlines of the goals that they believe that they're heading towards. Revolutions tend to narrate themselves in those teleological ways, but that, very detailed empirical level of detail shows us that people are making their own decisions, sometimes to go beyond those agendas, sometimes to do something different from those agendas. So one example from Dhufar is a former pupil at the Revolutionary School who recalled to me kinds of women that this image is representing. He recalled women who cut their hair short and wore masculine clothing, but he said his memory was that women refused to wear bras, and he explained that this was because bras reminded them of camels, and in a mobile pastoralist context, it's important to lay a cloth over the udder of a lactating female camel in order to reserve camel milk for human consumption. So we can see that these women, at least in his memory, are engaging with revolutionary social change, not having abandoned their own background, but interpreting through their experiences informed by mobile pastoralism and embracing some forms of revolutionary change, but saying no to others that weren't meaningful or attractive to them. So it's this kind of level of negotiation that in the book I call the idea of messiness. And by messiness, I don't mean chaos. I mean more a synonym of not, sorry, I've not said that sentence clearly. I mean an opposite of neatness. So rather than being neat and on this, clear, apparently preordained trajectory of arriving at a certain destination of revolutionary change, we get something that is more messy. But I don't see this messiness as the point of pathology, where the revolution didn't apparently offer the right things, or people weren't interested in what the revolution was offering or interested enough. Rather, I see that those instances of messiness as the signs of people's engagement with the revolution, because they were making choices, really weighing things up. And that leads me to suggest in the book, I quote, "Afterlives of Revolution arise not despite the messiness of revolutionary social change, but because of such messiness and the engagement it implies," end of quote. So that's one of the ways that I take up Afterlives for rethinking more broadly revolution studies, in that case, and thinking about, re-understanding what are these qualities of messiness and how might they impact the long term and the possibility of lasting legacies. So a second strand of the sort of panoply of problematic discourses in the model campaign thesis is the idea that it won a hearts and minds campaign of locals. And through that, I'm going to think about broader questions of the role of patronage and coercion in counterinsurgency campaigns. So when we take up the point of view of Afterlives, we see there are additional grounds to question the hearts and minds thesis, not only because the counterinsurgency relied heavily on violence to achieve its military victory. Also, from the perspective of Afterlives, we can see that at least for some people, some former participants in that revolution, the counterinsurgency distribution of resources has fallen short of erasing long-term engagement with revolutionary values, because people are still, in some aspects of their lives, still engaging with them decades later. And this has wider implications for the Gulf monarchies in particular, where the apparent formula for dealing with crises such as the Arab uprisings and the Dhofar Revolution has been to rely on a combination of patronage and coercion. In conventional tellings of the Dhofar conflict, the counterinsurgency campaign is even a poster for the apparent success in the extreme scenario of quelling revolution of this formula of relying on patronage. And of course, in practice, this patronage is always working in tandem with coercion to try and quell dissent. The perspective of Afterlives, when we think about the Dhofar Revolution, transforms the Dhofar campaign from being the apparent poster for the success of relying on patronage to erode dissent, to being evidence of the opposite, namely the limitations of patronage and indeed coercion for dispelling engagement with appetites for alternative political horizons. And these findings are again especially significant for scholarship on the Gulf. Anthropologists, sociologists, and historians, and political scientists, and fellow travelers, and some of those works that have inspired me on this slide here, have explored how people living in rentier states disrupt hierarchical rentier relations in arenas such as gender, generation, religion, and cultural heritage. A focus on revolutionary afterlives among former revolutionaries in Dhufar brings into view how minoritized political subjects, so a political minority here, in this case former revolutionaries, who are indeed part of networks of cooptation, still nevertheless reproduce values of social egalitarianism that contrast with the hierarchies that are at the heart of patronage between ruler and ruled and between stratified constituencies of clients. So a focus on afterlives allows us to further contest the model campaign thesis, showing the shortcomings of counterinsurgency patronage and coercion for erasing long-term engagement with revolutionary values, and shows how those who are co-opted can nevertheless still at the same time reproduce counterhegemonic values. That's being co-opted doesn't preclude those possibilities. And then finally, before concluding, I'm going to think about saviour narratives in the model campaign package, and through that think more broadly about the role of the everyday in post-war settings. So the counterinsurgency it sets itself up in its own sort of conventional narratives as saving Oman from the threat of communism, and therefore allowing, Sultan Qaboos to subsequently gift post-war modernization, what Omanis call their Nahda, awakening or renaissance, to the nation. So Afterlives of Revolution provide further material for questioning that kind of savior narrative. We have to contest the glorification of the counterinsurgency campaign because it's, we can recognize this as a white savior narrative. So echoing and, reworking the ideas of Gayatri Spivak, we can see that the conventional narratives that are setting up the British-led counterinsurgency as, saving Oman is a savior narrative of white men saving brown men and brown women from other brown men and brown women, in this case, communists. Paying attention to afterlives gives us still further grounds for contesting this kind of narrative. From the perspective of afterlives, which trace the long-term ongoing impacts of revolutionary agency that remain significant beyond military defeat, we can recognize that the conventional savior narrative is erasing the contributions of revolutionaries and former revolutionaries to post-war Oman's transformations. Former revolutionaries drew on revolutionary values to make distinctive contributions to post-war political, economic, and social life, including the very kinds of social change for which Oman's Nahda or Renaissance claims credit. Examples to this effect from Dhufar include that former revolutionary school pupils drew on their revolutionary values of the common good and maslaha al-amma to staff development projects in the early post-war period. In contrast, other Dhufaris who lacked a revolutionary education and who had been closer to counterinsurgency initiatives that encouraged tribal rivalries were unwilling to take part in development projects that would benefit tribes other than their own. So the actual nuts and bolts of delivering post-war development in the Dhufar relied on local people continuing to draw on their revolutionary values. Continuing attachment to revolutionary values was also significant for wider social change phenomena in the post-war period, including former female revolutionaries who continued to reproduce revolutionary gender egalitarianism in some areas of their lives, such as when they pioneered female labour force participation outside the home for women of all backgrounds, despite some women facing stigma for working outside the home. I'm talking here about the early post-war period. I'd be happy to say more in the Q&A about that, and indeed the broader question of what happened to the women from the revolution, because there are very gendered impacts of afterlives of revolution. So those are some ways in which in the lives of former revolutionaries, we can see that their values remain significant in the post-war period. But it's also the case that revolutionary values have wider transformative impacts in post-war Oman. In 2011, there were uprisings in various locations across Oman, including in Salalah, the main city in the Dhufar. A blogger, Eyewitness, who wrote about those protests, praised the socially inclusive values of protesters who mobilized around common grievances and were avoiding tribalism. And here, I argue, we see how outside the context of the actions of former revolutionaries themselves, revolutionary values are helping animate a subsequent post-war platform for progressive politics. So ongoing revolutionary values have had many impacts in post-war Oman. My finding that everyday interactions such as kinship and everyday socializing help to reproduce those very values invites us to reflect on the role of the everyday in post-war settings. Those living through and those seeking to understand conflict and post-conflict settings have often asked, how much does the everyday and quotidian relations, such as kinship and everyday interactions, allow survivors to reproduce and return to the normal life that the recent or ongoing conflict threatened? This anthropological work, some of which you can see on this screen, has shown how both during and after organised political violence, kinship and the everyday then can sustain or recreate a social world that violence once threatened. The Afterlives of Revolution in Dhufar nevertheless suggests that the role of post-war kinship and the everyday is not necessarily to reproduce the pre-conflict normal life. Rather, revolutionary afterlives in Dhufar speak to a different post-war challenge. What if people sought to preserve values, networks, and social relations forged in times of conflict, such as revolution, and that the official post-war status quo has marginalized? And this, I argue, is one of the things that seems to be happening in Dhufar, where we see that former revolutionaries, or at least some of them, continue to draw on revolutionary values such as the common good or social egalitarianism in their everyday lives in ways that continue the impacts of the revolution in the post-war period. Yet I stress with these everyday practices that there was no evidence that I came across that it caused resistance of concern to the Omani government. So I'm going to conclude very briefly. In the light of revolution's lasting afterlives in Oman, we can and must rethink revolution, counterinsurgency, and the aftermaths. From the perspective of revolutionary afterlives, the erasure and dismissal of revolution and the eulogization of counterinsurgency emerge all the more clearly as condemnations of the agency and resistance of colonized subjects and a legitimization of colonial violence. By contesting these colonial narratives and retrieving the agencies during and after the revolution that colonial tropes dismiss, the book attempts to be, and I quote here, an effort towards decolonizing narratives of revolution and counterinsurgency, end of quote. So I've developed further that idea of afterlife serving as a lens for decolonizing revolution in a subsequent article. You can see the reference there. But I will just conclude very briefly by saying these tasks of contesting colonial violence and retrieving the agency that colonialist accounts erase are urgent in Southwest Asia and North Africa today, as counter-revolutionary governments vilify the Arab Spring uprisings and amid the devastation of war for Palestinian civilians, revolutionary legacies in Oman and beyond seem more relevant than ever. So these are some further resources where you can read more about the book, or there may be resources that are useful for teaching. And I'm really looking forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alice. I'm going to stop recording now.